changes. The first time it's been run. Excellent.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
do you want me to turn down the lights?
I think this is the, okay. As long as it should be all right.
Okay.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is, it's always an issue about dealing with technology nowadays. It's sort of interesting that a lot of what we're talking about is technology gone awry. And sometimes we need the technology to help us solve that other technology problem. So my name is Andy Kanter, and I'm president of the National Physicians for Social Responsibility. Also, as Bob mentioned, on the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War on the board. And I'm actually going to be leaving next week to Hiroshima for the World Congress of IPPNW, and so this has special meaning to me. I'm really honored that you were able to invite me to come speak to you and for me to help you to commemorate this 67th memorial, I guess we could say, for the victims of Hiroshima. Especially grateful that we could have survivors here with us as well, because we all must be aware or cognizant of what has happened and never forget. So no more Hiroshimas and no more Nagasakis. I think also we have a connection to the Japanese people, not only because of the dropping of the bombs, but also now because of their experience with the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And they are still suffering and will continue to suffer from the effects of nuclear technology. And so our hearts go out to them in this time of struggle as well. So I'm going to speak tonight about a new piece of information which has come out from a series of studies that were done last year about the effects of nuclear weapons on global climate and agricultural production, specifically leading to famine. And I think this is actually important because this is good news and bad news. The bad news, of course, is that what I'm going to tell you is really horrific and scary and gives us an absolute essential reason for eliminating nuclear weapons now. The good news is that it confirms just how interdependent our planet is and just how incredibly interconnected we are with all of life on this planet, and that even small perturbations of our climate and our ecosystems have tremendous effects. Now, we can use that as a positive side as well to recognize just our common humanity. So the study that I'm going to talk about tonight was done by Dr. Ira Helfand and Physicians for Social Responsibility in conjunction with IPPNW. And it's going to talk about some initial work that was done in 2007 about a regional nuclear war. And then I'm going to talk a little bit later about the global implications of that regional conflict. Now, the original study was done on an exchange of nuclear weapons in South Asia between India and Pakistan. And they were chosen specifically, I think, because they were new weapon states and that they had a history of conflict. As a matter of fact, they had gone to war with each other 3 times since independence, and at least 2 occurrences since they became nuclear powers have been on the brink of launching nuclear weapons. This particular scenario involves an exchange of approximately 50 nuclear weapons of each side, about the Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs. This is about, Dr. Zia, you guys can correct me, about half of what their probable current arsenals are, so it's not an unreasonable expectation of that kind of an interchange. It's clear what the effects on the Indian and Pakistani people would be of these weapons if they had gone off in their cities. We can expect somewhere on the order of 20 million instantaneous deaths. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, perhaps 100,000 people were killed instantly, and another 50 to 80,000 people died soon after from just a single weapon on each city. But if you imagine 50 weapons from each of those 2 countries landing on the densely populated subcontinent, you can imagine there will be just tremendous devastation and acute death. But not only that, will there be diffuse radioactive contamination of the region, and as people probably even remember from the Chernobyl accident and the Fukushima nuclear power plant meltdown, that the radioactive contamination spreads a long way from where there are actual detonations. But the part that I'm really going to focus on tonight is the global climate disruption that's caused by the massive amounts of smoke and soot created by these nuclear weapons. So a nuclear weapon, and I'm pretty sure that most people are familiar with them at this point, produce massive amounts of heat and generally are expected within these dense urban centers to create a firestorm. So they will ignite huge fires that combust all of the burnable materials, particularly the petroleum products that are in the cities, generating huge amounts of soot and smoke that, unlike typical fires, are lifted high up into the stratosphere and where they spread out and block the sunlight. And we have had some recent experience with the volcano eruptions and how much disruption those created with a much smaller amount of soot and materials. Now this massive cloud of soot will actually decrease the amount of light that is coming in. It will decrease the amount of temperature in the order of about 1.25 degrees centigrade, and that this amount of disruption will last up to a decade of time. So if we look at what this actually means, it doesn't seem like 1.25 degrees centigrade is very much. But since the late 1800s, there's been about a 0.8 degree centigrade rise in temperature due to global warming. Now, this has happened gradually over the last 150 years, but we can expect that after a regional nuclear war, that the temperature would drop precipitously by 1.25 to a temperature that was actually colder than it has been in thousands of years. Now, this is really unprecedented amount of temperature drop in human history, and would be essentially the equivalent of like the ice ages. Now, some people look at this curve and they say, oh, well, this is the solution to global warming. All we have to do is launch off a bunch of nuclear weapons, put all of this soot up on the sky, and that we will cool the planet down. Well, not only is, for all the other reasons that I've mentioned, is that bad, but what happens after 10 years is not only does it go back up to where it was, but it goes back up to where the global warming temperatures were in the first place. So this is not a solution to global warming. Now, what this actually means, though, in terms of agricultural production and to the society of the global community, is that the cooling and the decreased light actually shortens the amount of time that plants can actually grow. And this chart, also by Alan Robock, who did the initial study with Professor Toon in 2007, shows the areas of dark blue are in the end, or the sort of somewhat dark blue, are about a 20-day reduction in growing season across, as you can see, large amounts of the agricultural areas of Eurasia, the Great Plains, and South America. Now, crops nowadays are highly sensitive to the amount of time that they actually have to grow, and a 3-week reduction in the growing season actually will dramatically reduce the amount of the crop production. Now, not only does the temperatures reduce the amount of light, but the cooling also actually changes the precipitation. And so this was one of the unique results of this atmospheric model that Toon and Robock put together, to show actually just how dramatically the weather patterns would change from this massive amount of smoke and soot. Now, this is very hard to see sort of because of all the numbers, but if you look across the main areas again of the growing seasons, we're seeing somewhere on the order of a 40 to 50% reduction in the amount of rainfall. Again, substantially affecting the amount available for agriculture. Now, prior to 2011, we really didn't know exactly what this meant for agriculture production. We didn't know what it meant for people who are likely to be on the brink of starvation even now. But we did have something that we could use from experience to help give us an idea. And this was the Tambora volcano that erupted in April 1815. And what this actually produced, even though this was a much lower amount of smoke, it only went into the lower parts of the atmosphere. It only lasted for a year, but it dropped about half of what we expected the nuclear war scenario to drop for a decade, 0.7 degrees. And this produced a year without the summer in 1816. Dramatic shortening of the growing season. There were killing frosts across the United States in June, July, and twice in August here in this country. And that famine was reported widespread throughout Europe, in Ireland, France, Switzerland, and Germany, and in India. And so this gave us initial understanding that just these small changes in in the temperature and precipitation caused by all these particulates in the atmosphere was likely to cause problems with agricultural production globally. So what does this really mean? And what the basics of the studies that were recently done last year was that the cooling, decreased sunlight, the less rainfall will reduce the growing season across the areas that I described. And this is going to reduce crop yields, and we can look at what does this actually mean for global health. In addition, the stratospheric ozone depletion caused by this particulate matter, the chemicals introduced into that area, also means that crops that are more sensitive to UV radiation will be affected. We know that this widespread disruption that would be caused by such a large impact on society would affect petroleum distribution. Therefore, if there's not petroleum, that means no pesticide use, no fertilizer, no crop machinery to be run. Again, vicious circle reducing the amount of crops that are produced. And just like in Fukushima, where wide areas of the country were contaminated and no longer available for agriculture production, we would anticipate also that radioactive and toxic contamination would affect large areas of the subcontinent. This would lead ultimately to collapse of the distribution system, rising prices, and of course, scarcity of food. We can also just remember, if we think just 2 years ago when some of the corn crop was actually redirected into biofuels, it produced a sort of mini reduction or scarcity in corn and actually increased the price of corn globally, affecting many people's ability to buy it. So the study that recently came out that Dr. Helfand and others have been presenting is the first time we've actually looked at what this would mean for agriculture production. And they ran a simulation about 300 times. They put these data with different sort of preconditions into this to their scenario. And they looked at, or at least Ozdogan looked at 4 places within the United States. That's Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri. And they looked at the corn production, and they noticed that if you run the simulation over and over again, the line that's going from top to bottom is no change. And you can see that although there's a bell-shaped distribution, there's a fairly uniform reduction in crop production, somewhere in the 15 to 20% range at the minimum. And sometimes, if you look at it, for example, in Illinois, it looks like it's probably larger. So this is pretty consistent across the Great Plains. They also looked at soybean production. There, again, it's a little bit more heterogeneous, but that we can expect somewhere on the order of a 10% reduction in crop across those 4 sites. Now, interestingly, the production in corn and soybean is not consistent over time. And what you see is that although the general period of time, or the reduction over the decade is consistent, there are certain areas, like in the 5th year, where the simulation shows even a greater fall in corn production. Now, we also wanted to look at what this would mean for Asia. And so a study by Zia and Robock actually looked at rice production. Now, rice production is even more sensitive to the, not just the temperature and the growing season time, but particularly precipitation. And you can see there that it's even greater, that there's more than a 20% reduction of crops over that decade. And that's over averaged out over the whole time. Again, if you look at this, it's not consistent over the decade. You can see that actually early on with rice, it's even more affected, where you can expect up to 30% reduction in the crops after the second year after the war itself. Now, unlike the United States, or at least the Great Plains states, where it was fairly consistent across the area, the geographical area, what you see in China actually is a wide distribution in what the effects would be. And particularly a rice-consuming country like China, this is a very important factor. And even though if you look on the south, there are some areas where there may be slight increases in crop production, by far, as you move north and west, the vast majority of regions are having significant reductions in crop. And the darker you get, the more of a reduction there actually is. Now, if we just take one of those states, for example, or provinces, the Heilongjiang province, involving 36 million people, what you see is like 1 year after the accident, it basically completely fails. The crop completely fails, and it really stays down upwards of 5 years. So you can imagine what this would mean for a population where even a small reduction in crop leads to increased prices and scarcity. To completely lose a particular crop would mean massive starvation. But what does that really mean in terms of the global society? As I mentioned, I think what this does show, for in one reason, is that we're actually globally connected, and our climate is affected by the climate elsewhere in the world. We also have a very interconnected food system. And because of that, and because of the efficiencies that have been put into the system, we've actually managed to reduce the amount of stored food that is being kept, because the food production system is trying to become more cost effective. So where in the 80s and so on there might have been more than 3 or 4 months worth of a global food supply, that's actually now been reduced to something like 2 months. So that means that in the world right now, that there's only about 2 months worth of food. And if there was some massive effect like this where an entire series of crops production were lost, there's not very much reserve for us to be able to fill in. And this is going to be really important, because when the people who are most affected by this in the subcontinent area, or those that are on the brink of malnutrition right now, there's not going to be food available to sort of use as emergency rations for them. So what does this really mean for all the people that are on the planet today who are perhaps on the brink of malnutrition or starvation? And we know that the average adult needs somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 calories a day to be properly nourished. Now, the amount of hunger in the world is actually quite large, almost 1 billion people. 925 million people are at that amount or below this level of dietary intake, and they're just making it by where we are right now. So the study organizers actually put this crop information to a group of economists, Webb et al., and asked them what would be the likely effect of this shortfall in crop production. Now, they actually used extremely conservative models for this. They assumed that the markets were going to work perfectly normally. There wasn't going to be any panic. That basically, what would be expected like now if the food price would go up by, or the crop production would go up by 10%, not including all the other things that I just mentioned. So this is a very conservative estimate. They showed that within 1 year, just looking at 1 year decline, you would have another 40 million people who would fall into the malnourished category. That if you looked at the year where there was the most fall in crop production, that 67 million people would be affected, and that if you look at the entire decade of this crop failure, another 215 million people would be malnourished and on the verge of starvation. So this is for the people whom actually aren't there now. For many of the countries like Japan and Korea, there are 50% or more of their food and rice are actually imported from outside countries, from major crop producing areas that are going to be heavily affected by this, crop reduction. So what this means, though, and we had some example of this in the past, for example, the Great Bengal famine, where even a small reduction in amount of available food causes people to hoard. And therefore, they don't actually export the food that they were expecting. So the countries that are highly dependent upon those exports are going to either face extremely high cost of food or no food at all. So what would this really mean for all those people that are sort of on the brink? Well, if there are nearly a billion people that are already below 1,750 calories per day, a 10% decrease in the amount of calorie production is substantial and puts that entire group at risk, particularly over the decade. And when you really think about everything that's going on, like I mentioned before, with the likely runs on food, the increased prices and so on, that this is going to make it a much greater impact. So which leads us to the question is, would this regional war having global climate effects literally put a billion people at risk of starvation? Now we know that when these famines happen, it's not just about the starvation, that they are typically accompanied by massive health-related problems like plague, cholera. There will be massive translocation of people, migrations of people moving away from areas where they can't get food to areas where they think that they can get food. These camps are just perfect areas to incubate cholera. You've got issues about malaria because they're not protected anymore, they're out in the open, and typhus. And perhaps even the scariest consequence of all of this is that in this highly strained area where there are massive amounts of hunger going on and resources unavailable, there will be the likely rise of military interaction between countries, where other countries are, looking for resources and for food, and this could lead even to additional uses of nuclear weapons, especially since the threshold will have finally been crossed again. So what does this really mean for us now? I mean, obviously to the people of South Asia, and we'll have a chance perhaps to talk, I mean, this would be devastating. But I think for us right now, we have an opportunity to prevent this thing that we cannot cure. And they require us to have a fundamental change about the way we think about nuclear weapons. Now, it may be that everyone here in this audience has already come because they already believe that we should abolish nuclear weapons. Maybe those of you who are out in the internet and online may be looking at this with not yet having made up their minds. But I'm hoping that maybe this information changes the way we think about nuclear weapons. So first we have to think and understand that it's no longer just about the arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union, or the ex-Soviet Union and Russia, that matter about posing a global threat. Because now it's possible that even smaller nuclear powers, like India and Pakistan, not only threaten themselves, but literally threaten all of humanity, because a regional nuclear war will have these global climate effects. We also have to really look at what the larger arsenals of the other nuclear powers, particularly the US and Russia, mean. And I suppose everyone here probably already knows, but for someone maybe who doesn't know the amount of nuclear weapons that are still around, can anyone guess how many nuclear weapons are still on the planet? The Cold War is over, we've been having New START, we've had all of this. How many? So 5 to 10,000. Actually, there's almost 20,000 nuclear weapons still around on this planet. Okay? So we have to look at these nuclear weapons not in the way that we used to look in terms of deterrence, because if these weapons, even a small 50 of them, if exchanged with a country, could have a billion deaths, I mean, what does it mean to deter? I mean, do we need 10,000 each between Russia and the United States, then 18,000 nuclear weapons? Obviously not. So if we take a look at what our nuclear arsenal is like right now, a single Trident submarine has 24 nuclear missiles. Each of those have 4 warheads. Each of those warheads have 20 to 30 times the size or yield of the Hiroshima bomb. And we have 14 of these nuclear subs. One of these subs could produce the nuclear scenario, the famine scenario that I've told you many times over. And we have 14 of them. So let's take a look at what would happen, because they not only looked at the climate effects of a regional nuclear war, but they said, okay, let's say we actually go to the New START levels, which is 1,550 nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia. And we say, okay, let's assume that there's a mistake, a miscalculation, which happened in the past where nuclear weapons have nearly been launched. And let's say there was actually a launch of these weapons. So in the original scenario, about 5 million tons of soot were created by the South Asian scenario. In this exchange between the United States and Russia, about the amount that would be on hair trigger alert right now, we could imagine there to be 15 megatons of metric tons of soot that would be elevated into the, 150 megatons of smoke would be entering the atmosphere. And what this would mean, and you saw how the blue before, it was kind of speckled throughout the areas of northern hemisphere. As you can see from this area, that there are massive drops in temperature that in year 2 that would again go out through almost the entire planet. So we're talking about, these are drops in temperature of somewhere on the order of 8 degrees on average, not 1.25. This would be essentially the time of the ice ages across the entire northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. It would eliminate probably almost all human life on the planet. So even today, with the most sophisticated models that we have for atmospheric predictions, the statements that we had in the past about global winter, or nuclear winter, are certainly true. So on one hand, small nuclear weapons, amounts of nuclear weapons, can produce a global climate catastrophe that would potentially threaten 1 billion people. A larger use of nuclear weapons would extinguish the human race. So again, when we think back on what it means to remember Hiroshima and what we have as a people, we have a choice. We can either continue along the path that we are doing now, based upon fear and antipathy to one another, fear of our enemies, that we need nuclear weapons to protect ourselves and to fight off terrorists or another unnamed country that we are soon to be enemies with, perhaps China. Or we can look at this highly interconnected planet as a lifeboat in space where all of our survival is dependent upon that planet and the interconnected ecosystem, and that these nuclear weapons pose a fundamental threat to our existence. And therefore, if we really do care about our children, and I just had a new 7-month first child born, so it's very real for me now to think about what it means for the future. We have got to change the way we think about this, and we have got to eliminate nuclear weapons, not just in memory of Japan, but certainly for Japan, but also for all people on this planet. Thank you very much.